Dead America, Idaho, Part 4. Dead America, the Second Month, Book 10. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Rebuild, Day 4, Afternoon. Cute. You think you're actually going to get the jump on Mr. Harris? The prisoner Conrad said with a sneer as he watched Sergeant Copeland's vehicle turn down a small dirt driveway and lying in wait under cover. Just a precaution, Kersey said, his voice monotone. Brett sat shotgun, glancing back at Moss, who was with their captive. Johnson and Baker were with Copeland, waiting for the signal. Pretty weak, if you ask me, Conrad scoffed. Brett clucked his tongue. Good thing nobody did, he snapped. Just to be clear, Moss declared, venom in his usual gentle tone, if your man tries anything, takes a shot at us, doesn't have Kowalski, or even so much as looks at me with anything other than mutual respect, I'm gonna gut you. He sneered. And not a slice across the belly, not a stab. I'm talking digging my blade in so deep that I can reach in, pull out your intestines, and strangle you with them. Brett blinked, shaking his head. Jesus, Moss, he muttered. The private jutted out his chin. Just want to make sure this motherfucker knows I'm not messing around, he huffed. So when he meets his man here in a minute, he can give him whatever subtle nod he wants to let him know not to fuck with us. Conrad simply chuckled. I'll take that under advisement, he drawled. You'd better, Moss warned. Kersey stopped the SUV at the head of the driveway, glancing over at the mailbox labeled O'Neill. Down the road, the glimmer of the sun reflected off of another vehicle about a mile up, but it wasn't moving. Okay, we do this quickly and cleanly, the captain said firmly. Brett, you clear the farmhouse. Moss, you secure the prisoner and wait by the front of the vehicle. I'm running point. If things go south, radio for backup. Both men replied in the affirmative, and Conrad added a, Yes, sir, in a mocking tone that prompted Moss to tap the hilt of his knife against the man's cheek. That shut him up quickly. Kersey made the turn down a long dirt driveway with trees on either side that ran for 20 yards or so. After that, they reached a clearing, with a huge 2-story farmhouse about a quarter-mile away, standing alone. Some large farm equipment, such as tractors, stood 100 yards or so away from the house, but there were no other buildings. Nothing but fields for hundreds of yards in every direction. If they have a sniper, that's going to be a bitch to deal with, Brett muttered. Probably no snipers, Moss said as he looked around, but enough hunters in this area to act the part. Bullets gonna hurt just the same, the corporal quipped. If they're out there, then we'll deal with them, Kersey cut in. Get focused. Yes, sir, both men replied as he approached the house. The captain parked about 20 yards from the building, and Brett immediately leapt out, moving quickly to the front door with his handgun drawn. He rushed inside to begin sweeping the house. Come on, get a move on, Moss said, grabbing Conrad by the handcuffs in front of him and jerking him forcefully out of the vehicle. The prisoner staggered as he emerged and opened his mouth to protest, but the soldier got in his face. Your boss is going to take you back regardless of your condition, Moss snarled. Remember that before you open your mouth. Conrad bit his tongue as he got to his feet, and Moss pulled him close. Didn't realize you swung that way, the prisoner drawled. Just making sure if one of your boys takes a shot at me, there's a good chance they're hitting you too, Moss replied. Conrad hesitated, his smirk falling at the realization. Moss pulled him to the front of the vehicle, putting their backs against it for more cover. Kersey, meanwhile, walked out about 20 yards in front of the SUV and reached into his pocket to pull out a small communicator that he attached to his collar. Copeland, do you copy? He asked.
Loud and clear, Captain,
the sergeant replied immediately. One SUV spotted mile up and most likely headed our way, Kersey reported. We are heavily exposed here, open fields for hundreds of yards in every direction, with the only path to us through the driveway. I want you to keep an open channel. First sign of trouble, I want you to come in here guns a-blazing. Shoot anybody who isn't us, understood?
Yes, sir.
Copeland came back.
Bloodbath protocol initiated.
Kersey chuckled. Not sure that's an official protocol there, Sergeant, he replied. Pretty sure that would violate some international laws.
If they object, they can file a complaint with the appropriate governing body,
Copeland quipped.
Somehow, I doubt they'll care.
Kersey barked a louder laugh. I like this new side of you, he said.
Not a new side, sir.
Copeland replied.
Just takes a lot to bring it out in me, and these suckers have done it.
The captain stared down the distance as 2 SUVs headed towards him. We're live, he said.
Got you covered, Cap,
the sergeant replied. Kersey glanced over his shoulder at Moss and Conrad, and then glanced up at the second floor of the house, where he spotted Brett's in a window. The corporal drew a finger across his neck in a clear signal that he'd dealt with some trouble up there. Copeland, covert hostiles eliminated, Kersey murmured into the communicator. This is going to be a shit show.
Just wait until I show up,
the sergeant replied, voice menacing. The captain went silent, watching the 2 SUVs park about 30 yards away from him. 6 armed men emerged, along with Kowalski, his hands cuffed in front of him, and Ted Harris, who stood unarmed. He walked up front, away from his men, and Kersey did the same, meeting him in the middle, a few yards away from each other. You must be the captain who has given my boys the business out here, Ted drawled, cocking his head, and given me oh so many migraines. And you must be Ted Harris, leader of the Chosen, Kersey replied, and shook his head with disdain. No lack of confidence on your part, that's for sure. Ted clucked his tongue. In that, I feel as though we are quite alike, Captain, he quipped. I don't think so, Kersey replied, shaking his head. I'm a lot of things, but pretentious enough to refer to myself as the Chosen isn't one of them. His opponent raised his chin. While that may be true, he replied, we do share the same level of confidence. I mean, you airdropped into my corner of the world with but a handful of men, thinking you could just run roughshod over us and take what doesn't belong to you. I'm pretty sure if I pulled the ownership records of those factories that your name wouldn't be on them there, bud, Kersey said with a sigh. Ted tisked. But my men and I are the ones who have sacrificed to protect it, making sure that they are still operational, he countered. This war with the dead is just beginning, I'm afraid, and what I have in my possession is worth more than just about anything still standing in this world. Of course, you know this, because why else would you be here otherwise? And we will happily compensate you for your troubles, the captain replied, raising his hands. You're barely holding your own against my men. Surely you know that you stand no chance against the full force of the U.S. military. To his surprise, Ted barked a laugh, grinning from ear to ear. If this was 6 weeks ago, boy, oh boy, you would be 100% right, he said with a wink. But let's face reality. It isn't 6 weeks ago, now is it? We're in a brand new world, and your threat carries very little weight. You may think of us as backcountry bumpkins because we choose to live out here in God's country, but we're more connected than you think. We have it on good authority that what's left of the military is tied up trying to secure Seattle and get it livable again, which isn't going so well. He leaned forward conspiratorially. From what we hear. Kersey kept his poker face meticulously schooled, but inside worry gnawed at his guts. Shortages of everything, Ted continued, counting off on his fingers. Food, fuel, and bullets. Lots of people in that area are sympathetic to those of us who have had to struggle to survive after you abandoned us, so they're more than happy to fill us in on the details of what's going on. So I know you're short-handed here. You can promise me the moon, and you would never be able to deliver. He cocked his head. I also know that if you do have reinforcements coming, they will be in such small numbers that we will be able to repel them. And something else to consider. If you try anything against us, you will have a lot more to deal with than just shortages. And I don't just mean here. Lots of freedom-loving people here in the Northwest would love nothing more than to give a rallying cry to pick up arms against what they see as invaders. Kersey pursed his lips. You've done your homework, he said dryly. What can I say, Captain? Ted said with a smirk. I'm an overachiever at everything I do." Kersey kept a straight face, his voice level as he asked, "So, what do you propose?" "I know you have taken up shelter amongst the population of Kuna," he drawled. "We have had our differences with them, but we have an understanding now." Kersey tongued his cheek. "An understanding, huh?" he asked. "Like trying to murder the people in their city?" Ted rolled his eyes. "There's a he said, she said portion to that story, but it is unimportant at the moment," he said with a wave of his hand. "What is important are the next words out of my mouth. So listen closely." He narrowed his eyes. "Take your men, lick your wounds, and be out of Kuna by sunrise. As we used to say in the bar industry, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here." Kersey sighed. "That's a tempting offer, Ted, but I think we're going to have to decline," he said casually. "It's a pity," his opponent replied, shaking his head. "I've been to Kuna many times. Lovely little town. It'll break my heart to have it wiped off the map." Kersey cocked a brow. "You are certainly welcome to try," he said. "But you just better be prepared to lose a lot of men in the process." "If that's what it takes to send your superiors the message that they need to leave us alone," Ted replied with a righteousness in his tone, "then it will be a price worth paying." The captain shrugged. "Well, this has been fun, but it seems as though you have an invasion to plan, and I have to get my men prepared for the mental anguish of having to kill so many of your men." He motioned between them. "So, what do you say we do our little prisoner exchange and go about our day?" "As you wish," Ted replied. "It's sad, really, because I think under different circumstances we could have been allies. Or dare I say it, even friends." Kersey blinked at him. "While I doubt that, I'd never deny you the right to dream a dream," he drawled, and motioned for Moss to bring Conrad forward. Ted did the same, and Kowalski was shoved towards them, walking towards the meeting area at the same time as the chosen prisoner. They stopped beside their respective captors. "Kowalski, you all good?" Kersey asked. The sniper grinned. "Never better, Cap," he declared, and extended his wrists. As Ted unlocked his cuffs, Kersey did the same thing for Conrad. "How are you feeling?" the leader asked, and Conrad shrugged. "I'm a little weaker than expected, but I'll get it together soon enough," he replied. Kersey noted Ted's nod at the very clear signal of their strength, but didn't let on that he'd gotten the message. He grabbed Kowalski's arm and led him back to Moss, still standing sentinel at the SUV. About halfway back to his own vehicle, Ted turned back. "Oh, one more thing, Captain," he called. "What's that?" Kersey asked, stifling a groan. "I want you to know, if you had taken my offer, that I would have kept my word about Kuna," Ted replied. "But now their fate is sealed because of your actions." The captain blinked at him, shaking his head in exaggerated confusion. "I'm pretty sure we just covered that a few seconds ago, bud," he said. "Mind starting to go in your old age?" "Oh, no," Ted replied with a smirk. "Just wanted to make sure you knew that before you die." He raised his hand and gave a spin of his wrist. Several moments went by, but nothing happened. He gave his hand a more exaggerated whirl, but there was still nothing. "Don't worry, bud. This kind of thing happens to the best of us," Kersey called brightly. "Let me show you how it's done." He mimicked the same motion with his wrist, and a second later Brett's fired from the second floor of the house, his first 3-round burst narrowly missing the chosen leader. The corporal adjusted his aim to the half-dozen men by the vehicles, who aimed and fired at the soldiers as Conrad and Ted ran for cover. Moss tossed Kowalski a gun, and they returned fire as they took cover with Kersey. Bullets continued to fly, hitting vehicles but miraculously missing bodies. Ted and a few others managed to get into one of their vehicles, and the captain leaned down against his communicator. "Any time, Sergeant," he cried. Tires squealed in the distance, prompting the firing to intensify from their opponents. "Nothing can be easy, can it, Cap?" Moss asked as he reloaded his rifle. Kersey shook his head. "Never is," he began, but he couldn't finish because his companion's head exploded in an array of blood and brain matter. He stared down at the spray of his friend's life splattered across his own clothes, dumbfounded for a moment before Kowalski grabbed him by the collar. Cap, snap out of it, the sniper barked as he shoved Kersey behind the SUV before firing towards the vehicles that were now fleeing down the driveway. I need a rifle. Kersey motioned for the back seat, finally shaking off his shock. As Kowalski opened the door to get his gun, the captain raised his radio to his lips. Man down, he cried. We got a sniper in the woods. Kowalski was pissed, but focused. He reached the front of the vehicle, hiding behind the wheel well. He glanced back at Kersey, who was still sitting on the ground. Tell whoever is in the house to fire into the woods, he barked. I don't care where. The captain nodded, switching channels on the radio. Bretts, fire into the woods, he said. Just keep doing it until I tell you to stop. A second later, bullets ripped out from the house towards the trees several hundred yards away. As soon as the spray began, Kowalski popped up from behind cover, scanning the area through the scope of his rifle. After several seconds, he finally spotted some movement, someone running towards the road through the woods. Got you, motherfucker, he muttered, and tracked his prey, leading his target ever so slightly before pulling the trigger. A second later, the man dropped to the ground, and the sniper continued to aim at him, waiting for him to move again, but he didn't. Kowalski scanned the woods for more movement, but didn't see anybody else. We're clear, he called. You can stop firing, Bretts, Kersey said into the radio, and as soon as the corporal ceased fire, more gunfire erupted in the distance. Tires screeched, and then there was an explosion. The soldiers looked at each other, concerned, and Kersey frantically flipped the radio back to Copeland's frequency. Sergeant! Sergeant! He cried. There was a brief moment of silence, and then he growled, Copeland, so help me God, if you're dead, I'm going to kill you! There were a few more moments of silence, and then finally the radio clicked back.
I'm good, Captain,
Copeland said.
Had to break off pursuit. They threw a pipe bomb that nearly got us. Barely avoided it.
Kersey breathed a sigh of relief. It's okay, he assured him. You need to get over here now. Just prepare yourself. Moss is down. There was a long pause, and then Copeland said solemnly,
Understood.
Kersey stared at his fallen friend, who was missing a significant portion of his head. He still couldn't believe it. Kowalski approached, still holding the rifle, just as Bretts emerged from the house and clenching his jaw in frustration. Captain, Kowalski, the corporal asked. You two okay? The sniper grunted in response. Yeah, just pissed off, he declared. Kersey remained silent, still staring at his friend's body. The other soldiers clustered around him, looking at Moss in silence, taking a moment to remember their fallen friend. The seething hatred of the Chosen grew. Something had to be done. Chapter 2. Kersey drove the lead vehicle into Kuna and slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. The townsfolk milling about stopped to stare as the captain got out of the SUV and slammed the door behind him, a fire in his eyes that made people back away slowly. Zeke approached, brow furrowed. Captain, is everything? Get the rest of my men and meet me in Yvonne's office. Kersey cut in forcefully. Go now! Zeke didn't question him, simply turning and running off. Everybody to Yvonne's office, Kersey barked, and then pointed to Copeland. Except for you, Sergeant. I need a word. The soldiers nodded and walked off, leaving the two men alone. Copeland's jaw clenched and unclenched with unbridled rage at losing another one of his men. What is it, Captain? He asked through gritted teeth. Kersey raised his chin. We're going to talk about what our next move is, he said. But I get the sense I already know what your feelings on the subject are. I want to kill them all, Copeland said firmly. It may come to that, the captain agreed, and I will advocate for your position for you. However, I have something more pressing. The sergeant nodded. Okay, he said. I need you to alert the wall guard that trouble is on the way, so they need to remain vigilant. Kersey explained. Get any scout you can and send them out. Copeland nodded again. What are they looking for? In talking with Ted Harris, I got the distinct impression he doesn't make a move without having several more set up and ready to go, the captain replied. The sergeant nodded thoughtfully. So you believe him when he says he's going to wipe this place off the map? He asked. I do, and the sooner we know what that plan is, the better, Kersey replied. So, get the scouts out there looking for anything out of the ordinary. Yes, sir, Copeland replied firmly, and headed off. Kersey watched him go, stiff-shouldered and still thrumming with anger, and then walked to Yvonne's office to converse with his men. He understood the anger. He didn't often lose his temper, but losing 2 men because self-righteous assholes didn't want to share was beyond him being able to stay calm. He entered the room. "Yvonne, Before you talk, Captain, you're going to let me speak, because you're a gentleman, after all," she cut in with a drawl. He nodded, clamping his mouth shut and closing the door behind him. "I'm very sorry to hear about Moss," she continued, eyes softening. "Losing a friend is never easy, especially under those circumstances. So I want you to know, whatever needs to be done, you have my blessing." He sighed heavily. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. "I wish it was that simple." "It is, Captain," Yvonne said, pressing her palms down on her desk. "It is. Now say what you need to say." He took a deep breath. "I was given an ultimatum by Ted Harris," he explained. "Either we vacate this town or he threatened to wipe it off the map. I don't know how he plans to pull that off, but I believe he intends to try, which means we have to figure out our next move, and I mean right now." "I'm guessing your reinforcements aren't going to be here anytime soon?" Zeke asked, cocking a brow. Brett shook his head. "At least a week out, assuming they don't have to take any large detours thanks to zombies on the road," he explained. "So we're on our own for now." "I say we hit them where they sleep," Dawson piped up. Baker sighed, shaking his head. "A lot of potential casualties if we do that," he pointed out. "And my guess is it's not going to all be bad guys either." "Kowalski, you've been inside Nampa. What did you see?" Kersey asked, turning to the sniper. Kowalski shrugged. "A community kind of like this, with some minor differences," he replied. "They have huge fortifications that put ours to shame. A giant metal wall outside of a large brick one. So we're not getting in with that overwhelming force." "How many civilians?" the captain asked. Kowalski shook his head. "That's hard to tell," he admitted. "There are a fair amount of civilians who were roaming free, but all of them were a part of the Chosen. There were a significant amount of civilians who weren't part of their group, though." "How could you tell?" Dawson asked. "Might have something to do with the fact they were slaves," the sniper said dryly. The room fell silent as everyone seemed to struggle with that information. "My God," Yvonne finally breathed. "They have slaves in Nampa?" Kowalski nodded, clenching his jaw. "I didn't get a full tour of the town, but I would say conservatively that it's about a quarter of the population," he replied. "Mother of God, Captain Kersey, you have to do something," Yvonne pleaded, turning her gaze to him. "My great-grandparents were slaves, so as you can imagine, I'm not a big fan of the institution." Baker threw his hands up. "Question is, what do we do?" he demanded. "Any assault is going to risk their lives." "But if we do nothing, they're stuck being slaves," Dawson shot back. Kersey stood silent, thinking to himself as the group chattered around him. After a moment, he let out a loud whistle, waiting for his men to quiet down. "Kowalski, walk us through how you got there in the first place," the captain suggested. The sniper nodded. "Oh, that's easy," he replied, crossing his arms. "Couple of dinguses poisoned me and called them up, hoping to trade me for the ability to live inside Nampa. Well, they got their wish, just the monkey's paw variety, where everything went to shit." "Where did they hold you?" Kersey asked. "Small makeshift cell," Kowalski explained. "A couple of them in a small room in a building on the outskirts of town. If someone had the right tools, they could certainly break free if they knew what they were doing." Kersey nodded. "That's our play, then," he said firmly. The sniper blinked at him in disbelief. "You want to call them up and turn yourselves in?" Kowalski asked, shaking his head. "I don't think they're going to buy that, since they know our faces." "They don't know mine," Wade piped up, raising his hand. "Only people who know I exist are the ones whose lights I punched out with my rifle. Question is, who are we taking in?" "Copeland for sure," Kersey said with a sigh. "I don't want to be the one to tell him he can't go on this mission." Dawson chuckled and shook his head. "Knowing Sarge the way I do, you wouldn't be able to tell him no," he said. "Still, if it's as fortified as Kowalski says, could probably use a third man inside." "I'll do it," Brett said. Kersey cocked a brow. "You sure, Corporal?" he asked. Brett nodded. "Wouldn't be the first cell I've broken out of," he pointed out. Ah, yes, the Tijuana incident, Kowalski drawled. Told you that you couldn't hold your liquor? The corporal narrowed his eyes. If I recall, he said, raising a finger, you were in there with me. Yeah, but I already knew I couldn't hold my liquor, Kowalski admitted with a shrug. Kersey turned to Zeke. Please take Wade and Brett to the supply room so they can get whatever they need to be able to get out, he instructed. I'll radio Copeland and have him meet you there once he's wrapped up with the scouts and others. He's talking to our scouts? Yvonne asked, raising an eyebrow. The captain nodded sheepishly. My apologies, he said gently. We don't have much time, so I had him send out the scouts to look for trouble. It's okay, she said, waving a hand. You're just doing what's best for everyone here. Carry on, Captain, and let me know what you need. All of our resources are at your disposal. Thank you, he replied with a firm nod. I don't suppose you have an inventory of what you have in town? He asked. She smirked. Oh, honey, I'm prepared, she said, and opened one of her desk drawers, pulling out a spiral notebook that looked well worn. She flipped through it, turning to a page near the back, and handed it over. This is our current weapon capacity, as well as things that could be used as weapons, like those pipe bombs Mr. Kowalski is so fond of. She threw the sniper a wink. Thank you, Kersey said as he scanned the list. This will help. He turned to the remaining troops in the room and tossed the notebook to Kowalski. Okay, I want you to pore over that and see what you can come up with. The sniper nodded. What's the threat? He asked. Assume for the worst and work your way back from there, Kersey instructed. Until we have firm intelligence, I want worst-case scenarios. Yes, sir, Kowalski replied. And the captain left, leaving the men behind in the office with Yvonne. He took a moment to take a deep breath in the hallway and gather himself, letting it out through his teeth. This mission had just gone from a skirmish to a full-scale war. Chapter 3. The sun grew low in the sky as Wade, Copeland, and Brett drove up to an abandoned farmhouse about 10 miles south of Nampa. A few zombies roamed around outside of it, but nothing major. Wade drove a beat-up pickup truck they'd gotten from Kuna and parked it close to the house. He adjusted his tattered farmer's clothing that they'd covered in several prominent bloodstains. He glanced at the still bleeding cut on his arm that he'd self-inflicted to sell the story. You think we should leave those zombies alive? Brett asked. Or put them down? Wade shrugged. Let's put them down. Might make our story more believable, he suggested. I still don't see how they're going to buy this, Brett muttered. Wade cocked a brow. What, you don't think I'm capable of subduing 2 soldiers on my own? He teased. I think it would be better if you told them we killed a couple of your friends, but you ultimately got the jump on us, the corporal replied. In that case, I should leave you in the truck bound and gagged in the back, Wade replied. Brett glanced at Copeland, who shrugged. I don't care how we get there, let's just get there, the sergeant replied gruffly. All right, Brett said with a sigh. Just kill those zombies first. Don't want to be laying out in the open like a damn buffet. Wade nodded, pulling out his handgun and blasting the few zombies that had slowly been working their way over towards them. As he did, Copeland and Brett climbed into the back of the truck, helping each other bind their arms and gag their mouths. Once the corporal was in place, Wade helped Copeland finish himself up. Don't worry, Sarge. I'm going to keep a watch on you in case any more of those things come up, Wade promised, gag in hand. The sergeant nodded. You just do what needs to be done once we're inside, he said firmly. You can count on me, Wade said, and fastened his gag. As he got down, Copeland laid down next to Brett's, and the private went inside the farmhouse. Okay, Zeke said it was in the back bedroom, Wade thought to himself as he worked his way carefully through the large house, making sure he was alone. When he swept everywhere, he opened the door to the back bedroom, revealing a radio set up in the corner. And it's there. Good job, Zeke. Wade sat down, pulling out a piece of paper from his pocket and dialing the radio into that frequency. He took a moment to compose himself before speaking. Hello? He asked. Anybody in Nampa? Come back. There was a moment of silence before somebody replied. This is Nampa. And then,
"Who is this?"
Well, Wade stammered, playing his part. "My name is Wade, sir. I'm a farmer from just outside the city. I have something that might be of interest to you."
"And what might that be?"
the person on the other end asked. Wade took a deep breath. It was his moment to shine. "I heard through the grapevine that y'all were looking for some soldier boys, and I managed to get a couple. Looking to make a trade for some sanctuary." There was a long pause, and then the person said,
"Hold on."
The line went dead for a couple of minutes before a different voice came over the line.
"So, you caught some soldier boys, huh?"
A man drawled, doubt clear and present in his voice. Wade could almost hear the sneer and assumed this was Conrad.
"Why don't you explain to me how a farm boy such as yourself managed to accomplish that feat?"
Wade took a deep breath and faked a nervous stammer. "Well, sir," he said, running a finger down the piece of paper that Zeke had written out for him. "I've been staying out near the old Neal farm. It was my cousin's place. The Schaefer place?" He paused. "Not sure if you know of it or not, but I've been staying there the last few weeks with my cousin Jason. A few hours ago we heard a heck of a commotion, lots of gunfire, and then a big explosion. We drove up in this truck and found their SUV wrecked on the side of the road. Don't know what caused them to wreck. Figured it must have been that explosion. But two of them were still moving."
"And your first instinct was to kidnap them?"
Conrad asked dryly. "Well, yes, sir," Wade replied immediately. "We both have heard your radio broadcasts of late about looking for these soldier boys, and we were kind of hoping it would be our ticket out of the wilderness, so to speak. So we loaded the two survivors in the back of the truck and took off." There was a short pause, and then Conrad asked,
"So, you and your cousin want refuge in our little community then, huh? All we have to do is come pick you up at the old Schaefer place, is it?"
Wade lowered his voice into a solemn tone. "Well, sir, I'm not at the Schaefer place anymore," he said. "And my cousin isn't with us any longer. Some of the soldier boys' friends showed up, saw what we were doing, and started firing at us. Jason took a shot right through the heart as we were getting away." He paused for effect, swallowing hard as he double-checked his cheat sheet. "I was too scared to go back to his place, so I drove to the owner of the farm I knew had a radio, the Dallin place. It's about 10 miles south of Nampa. Tiny little place, but worked a summer out here a few years back."
"So it's just the three of you then?"
Conrad asked. Yes, sir," Wade replied.
"And where are the soldiers at now?"
Conrad continued. The soldier took a deep breath. "They're secured in the back of my truck bed," he replied. "Bound and gagged, not going anywhere." There was a long pause, and then Conrad finally said,
"Okay, seems as though your story checks out. You sit right there, and I'll have some people over to you by sundown. But if you try anything funny, even so much as thinking about holding a firearm in their presence, they will cut you down where you stand. Is that understood?"
"Oh, yes, sir," Wade agreed, making sure his voice was shaky but amenable. "I don't have a firearm on me, and neither do they. I'll be sitting on the front porch waiting for you."
"We'll be there soon,"
Conrad replied, and then the line went dead. Wade pulled out his handgun, stared at it for a long moment, and then sighed before he tossed it onto the radio table. "Would have been nice to keep that with me," he muttered. He got up from the desk and walked back towards the front of the house. When he emerged, a zombie was slowly approaching the truck, and he casually walked up to it, jamming his knife into its skull and throwing it down. He stood by the side of the truck, and Copeland mumbled something through his gag. Wade nodded. "Yeah, I think they bought it," he replied. "Had just enough details where he didn't call bullshit on it." The sergeant mumbled some more. He said by sundown, but since they're only 10 miles away, they could be here in a matter of minutes, Wade replied. Copeland mumbled some more, and the private smiled down at him. "Thank you, Sarge," he said softly. "I tried my best. Just sit tight. We'll be within their walls soon enough." He reached into the truck bed, patting his sergeant on the back before heading back to the front porch. He sat down, looking out at the sky as the sun got lower and lower, setting the horizon aglow with a spectacular view. It's cold as balls, and I expect it to start snowing any second now. But damn if that isn't one amazing view, he thought, and rubbed his hands together. Chapter 4. The sun had nearly vanished over the horizon, and the clouds rolled in, creating overcast conditions and making preparations more difficult without the moonlight. Kersey walked around, directing traffic, sending people in every direction. "How are we looking on the south side of town?" he asked one of the civilians. The stout man straightened his shoulders. "We have half a dozen men over there keeping watch, but it's nothing but fields over there," he said. "Not easy terrain either. Still, send a few more people over there and make sure they have long-range scopes," Kersey instructed. "I don't want to leave anything to chance." He glanced up at the inky sky. "Don't suppose you have night vision, do you?" he asked. The civilian nodded. "I think we might have 1 or 2 hunting scopes with them," he replied. "Okay. Regardless if it's 1 or 2, give them to the most mobile people you have," Kersey instructed. "I want them spending 5 minutes at a wall before moving back to a different one. Until the scouts get back and we know what we're dealing with, we have to assume the worst, which means them coming up over rough terrain with God only knows what." "I'll take care of it, sir," the civilian promised and ran off, quickly replaced by Baker. "Captain," he said firmly. Kersey turned to him. "What is it?" "2 of the 5 scouts have come back so far," Baker reported. "Nothing out of the ordinary, usual straggler zombies, but no sign of the Chosen, or anything else." "What directions did they go?" Kersey asked. Baker checked his notes. "One went due east, the other went to the southwest," he replied. "Okay, keep me posted," the captain replied. "In the meantime, head over to the western wall and give a talk with those guys. Give them some pointers on what to look for, and make sure they know the signaling protocol." "On it, Cap," Baker said. But before he could leave, there was a commotion at the front gate. Yells erupted and people began to crowd towards it, and Kersey's brow furrowed. "That can't be good," he said, and led the other soldier towards the front gate. A crowd grew around a scout on a dirt bike. "Captain Kersey!" he cried. "I need to see Captain Kersey immediately!" Kersey shoved his way through the bodies. "I'm here. What's going on?" he asked. "I don't know if it's the Chosen or not, but there's 1,000 zombies headed our way," the scout stammered. Everyone around them fell deathly silent, and the captain clenched his jaw. "Where are they?" he asked. The scout pointed at the front gate. "About 3 miles away," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't see them sooner, but I did a big loop around some side roads to make sure the Chosen weren't staging at any of the nearby farms, started coming back on the main road, and ran smack into the ass end of them. Thankfully I saw them in time, or else I would be a stain on the blacktop." "You get a good sense of how fast they are going?" Kersey asked. The scout tilted his head back and forth. "They're moving at a good clip, probably going to be on us within the hour," he said. "So, what's the big deal?" Baker asked with a shrug. "We can just wait until they get here and pick them off, can't we?" One of the guards shook his head. "This gate isn't meant to withstand that kind of pressure," he said. "We had a pack of 100 a week ago, and it nearly brought the whole thing crashing down. If they were on the outer wall, we might be okay, but this front gate is weak, because we need to be able to open it." "Shit," Baker muttered. Kersey put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a loud whistle that echoed loudly throughout the base. "I need a map of this area," he barked. "I don't care if it's hand-drawn, but I need to know what is between us and them, and I need it now." "I got one at my station," one of the guards piped up. "I'll be right back." "Baker, get the rest of our guys and Zeke," Kersey continued, "and meet me at the supply depot in 5. "On it," the private replied, and ran off. The guard pushed through the crowd with a piece of paper in his hand, holding it out to Kersey. The captain took it and held it up in the dim light. There was a main road leading straight up, with one almost directly outside of town, and only one other way up. "Okay, walk me through it," Kersey said. "What's the scale?" The guard leaned over his shoulder and pointed as he spoke. "This close one is no more than a 1/4 mile from us," he explained. "Heads off to another highway about 1 mile down." "And this other road?" Kersey asked. The guard shook his head. Right at about 3 miles out, he replied. If what the scout said is true, they're probably already past it. The captain pointed to the area between the roads. So, what's on this main one? He asked. Anything we can use to our advantage? You got 2 blocks of buildings right outside the gate, the guard explained as he motioned. With a 2-story building there on the corner. Past that, it's nothing but farmland. I don't think there are any actual farms, just land. Most of it is fenced off pretty significantly, but there's a stretch somewhere around here where fencing is only barbed wire. You should be able to cut through it pretty easily. Other than that, there's nothing. Kersey pursed his lips and then nodded. Thank you, he said, pocketing the map. I want the best shooters you have lined up on the top of the front gate. As soon as they're within sight, I want you to light them up. The guard pointed up. We don't have spotlights, sir, he said, and with no moon, it's going to be impossible to see them. One problem at a time, Kersey replied. I'll take care of that. You just be ready to shoot. Yes, sir, the guard replied. The captain took off to the supply room, where Zeke waited with the soldiers. They were all loading up on supplies, and he walked into the middle of the room and let out a whistle before slapping the map down onto the table. We don't have a lot to work with, he said loudly. There are only 2 roads we could pull them off of, and most likely they're already past one of them. The other is right outside of town, and that's risky because if we don't pull enough away, they'll have a strong enough force to collapse the front gate. Only other possibility is a barbed wire fence somewhere in this area where we can peel some off. Just need a distraction. Dawson raised his hand. Pipe bomb ought to do it, he suggested. We're not going to have any moonlight, so I doubt it's going to be very effective, Kowalski said, shaking his head. If we had a spotlight, that might hold their attention. Baker sighed. Seem to be fresh out of those, he said. But what if we weren't? Zeke asked, eyes lighting up. Then we'd have spotlights, Baker replied, brow furrowing in confusion as he shook his head. Do you have some or not? Zeke shook his head. No, but I have an idea, he said. Be right back. He took off out the door, leaving the soldiers staring after him for a beat, before Kersey turned back to the map to get everyone back on track. We have a 2-story building on the corner here, he said. Kowalski, I want you up there to pick off whatever you can. Meanwhile, the 4 of us will be doing what we can to peel them off at the farmland, assuming Zeke has something useful. As if on cue, the man came running back in. He tossed down a handful of fireworks, Roman candles, and some other ground-based ones that would send colored sparks 5 yards or so into the air. Think these will work? He asked breathlessly. Colorful, bright, and makes a whistling sound, Dawson said triumphantly as he picked one up. I think we're good. Baker picked up a Roman candle, turning it over in his hand. You got any more of these? He asked. Zeke nodded. Got a couple cases of them, he said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Get them, Baker instructed. Kowalski, take a few batches up to the roof. Might be able to light up the area so the shooters at the gate can hit their targets. The sniper shook his head. These things aren't very bright, he said. I don't know how well we're going to work. Now, a Molotov? He raised a finger and wagged it. Couple of those on the ground will do the trick. Kersey sighed. If that's what we're reduced to, then we're in trouble, he said. But still, Zeke, can you hook him up? Should be able to scrounge up a handful, came the reply. Okay, get your ammunition, make sure you have lighters, and be ready to move in 5, the captain instructed loudly. We're on the clock, and time is not on our side. Chapter 5. Wade rode in the back seat of a packed SUV with several other chosen members as they approached Nampa. He looked out the back, seeing the pickup truck with Copeland and Brett's trussed up in the back, following behind. But it was difficult to see well, with the sunset and the clouds blocking the moon. Okay, copy that, the guy in the passenger seat said into his radio. Processing to backup position. What's going on? The driver asked. One of the gate guards popped off his rifle a few too many times today, and now they got a crowd, the passenger said. The driver scoffed. Christ, again? He whined. I'm not cleaning up those bodies again. Just disgusting. How many this time? 500, it sounds like, the passenger replied. Worst part is, they can't really do a lot till morning. Mr. Harris doesn't want us wasting ammunition by shooting in the dark." Wade furrowed his brow, feigning fear and confusion. "But is the gate strong enough to hold?" he asked, leaning forward. The two men turned and glared back at him, and he pretended to shrivel away from them. "That gate's plenty strong," the passenger snapped. "Unless they have a battering ram, they aren't getting through it. But that should be the least of your worries, friend." Wade gulped, pretending to be worried, even though the plan was working as well as they'd hoped it would. The two-vehicle convoy took the long way around town, coming up to the back side of it. They pulled up to a small dirt parking area beside the metal fence exterior, and the driver laid on the horn to let the guards know they'd arrived. "All right, Farmer John, let's go," the driver drawled. Wade got out of the vehicle and looked around, unsure of where to go next. After a few moments, a ladder dropped down. "All right, up you go," the driver said. "How are you getting those military boys up?" Wade asked, inclining his head to the truck. "Don't think it's wise to let them out of their restraints." The driver rolled his eyes and motioned to the top. A moment later, a rope descended with a hoop at the end. Wade nodded at it and let out an impressed whistle. But in the back of his mind he cringed at how badly his companions were going to hate being hauled up by a loop. "Now, come on and start climbing, or else we're going to hook you up," the driver snapped. "Oh, okay, yes sir," Wade said quickly, and began climbing. A few tiki torches at the top showed where the ladder stopped, and he made it to them, where two armed men helped him over the gate. "Thank you," Wade said. "Shall we take him to holding?" one of the guards asked. Wade widened his eyes. "Holding?" he exclaimed. "Now just wait a damn minute." The guard raised a hand, and then looked down at the men who'd driven him there. "No," the driver called up. "Mitch called and wanted you to take him to Mr. Harris's house. He'll meet you there." "Will do," the guard replied, and gave Wade a shove. "Come on, get moving." Small solar-powered garden lamps lit the way down the ramp, zip-tied to the railing all the way down to the street. The neighborhood was lit up completely with those little lights so people could find their way. Even though it was dark, there was still a lot of activity with people walking down the street, carrying goods, and moving along. "Don't you all ever turn in for the night?" Wade asked as they reached the street. "Just because the sun goes down doesn't mean there isn't work to be done," the guard replied gruffly. "Now start walking. We have a hike ahead of us." Wade nodded and kept going, keeping his eyes bouncing around everywhere for anything that might be useful. As they walked, he spotted a medium-sized moving van sitting in front of a house. A few people unloaded goods out of the back and took them inside. He made sure to take in everything possible, no matter how mundane, hoping the others were okay. The guards on the wall pulled Brett's over the side, dropping him hard on the metal floor. As he grunted, Copeland stared daggers at the guard. "What you gonna do, huh?" the guard said with a sneer, and the sergeant gritted his teeth. He was still bound, hands and feet, and couldn't do anything at the moment. But he gave the man an intense stare down, which seemed to unnerve him as he withered a little under it. The guard finally turned away and let out a whistle to the guy on the ground. "What is it?" somebody called back. "Bring a truck around," the guard instructed. "We have a couple of guests for Joshua to meet." "Yes, sir," came the reply. A truck revved up, and the guards escorted the soldiers down the ramp, the two of them waddling like newborn ducks, barely able to move their legs with the binding. At the bottom, a truck waited, and the guard opened the tailgate and smacked it a few times. "Get your ass up here," he said. Copeland stared him down again, and the guard seemed unnerved, but then shook it off. "Either you get up there, or this is where your journey ends," he said, tapping the gun in his side holster. The soldiers sighed and turned around, hopping up onto the tailgate and rolling into the truck bed. Once they were inside, the guard slammed it shut and walked to the driver's side, muttering to himself as he went. "You think you're bad now? I'm going to make sure Joshua sees you first," he said, and got into the cab. Copeland and Brett shared a look as the truck took off, and it felt like it was a purposely bumpy ride as they were thrown around like rag dolls. Wade entered Ted's house, and Mitch stood there waiting for him. The guy cocked a brow.
So, this is our farm boy, huh? He asked, pointing to some tattoos peeking out of the soldier's clothes. Don't really look the part. Well, we all make mistakes when women are involved, am I right? Wade drawled. Mine just happens to be a little more permanent than most. Mitch gave him a stare down, narrowing his eyes, but then finally cracked a smile and clapped the soldier on the arm. Yeah, I can relate, he said, ushering Wade inside. Had a 6-week stretch in my youth where I went vegetarian for this girl. Didn't take me long to come to the conclusion that I was A-OK beating my meat if it meant I could eat meat. Wade chuckled. 6 weeks as a vegetarian? He asked with a playful shudder. I'll stick with the tattoos. Mitch led him through the front of the house, seeming far warmer than he had when they approached. The 2 armed guards at the door stayed outside, and Wade entered a living room where Ted Harris himself sat in a chair next to a camping lantern with a book in his hand. When they entered, he slapped the book shut and tossed it aside, getting to his feet. Ted Harris, the man greeted. Nice to meet you. Old Mitch here treating you well? Yes, sir. We bonded over making mistakes when it comes to women, Wade replied politely, shaking his hand. No man is truly a man until he's lost a little bit of himself in pursuit of a woman, Ted said with a wink and motioned to the couch across from him. Please, take a seat. Wade sat down and Mitch turned to leave, but Ted raised a hand. I'd like you to stay, he said. Could really use a second set of eyes and ears for this conversation. Mitch's brow furrowed. Okay, sir, he said, and walked over to a table nearby, pulling up a chair and leaning forward, sitting quietly. Now, son, I'm going to level with you, Ted began, raising his chin as he regarded his new guest. I'm a firm believer in the Lord. He has blessed me and mine immensely, especially in these dark times we find ourselves in. His power is infinite, and I have every belief in him to lead us through, providing us with what we needs to be provided, no matter how difficult it is to find. He raised a finger. But even with that unwavering faith, I find it difficult to believe that someone claiming to be a simple farm boy could capture 2 highly trained soldiers who have managed to kill so many good men over the past few days. There was a short silence, in which Ted stared coolly at his guest, and Wade stared back at him with healthy concern. So, you and I are going to have a little chat about everything that transpired today, Ted continued. Now, I know that you told my man Conrad over the radio, but it's easy to deceive when you are shielded from view. He leaned back, casually propping his foot up on his other leg. If I believe what you tell me, then maybe we can work something out for you to do here that doesn't involve back-breaking labor. He pulled a handgun from his hip and set it down beside him. If I don't believe you, then old Mitch here is going to have to break out the cleaning supplies. Wade didn't overreact, despite his heart pounding, but feigned a proper amount of concern on his face, because that was what a simple farmer would do. Okay, yes, sir, he said emphatically with a nod. I will tell you the truth about everything. Good, Ted quipped. I'm glad to hear it. Now, let's begin. Chapter 6. It was almost completely dark after the sun vanished completely over the horizon. The clouds were thick in the sky, only the occasional ray of moonlight piercing through to highlight the road or the fencing running alongside it. Kersey parked a pickup truck by the side of the road. Baker, Johnson, and Dawson got out with him. The 4 of them with their guns raised and ready for anything. Baker, figure out where they are, Kersey instructed. Johnson, Dawson, get that fence cut down to size. Should be up on the right. I'll get the goods. Yes, sir, came the chorus of voices, and Baker took off first, running up the road. He pulled out a small flashlight and shone it ahead, making sure he didn't run straight into a pack of zombies. The light was powerful enough to cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. He stopped after a few hundred yards listening, and he could hear the faint sound of moans and footsteps ahead. He kept walking, holding the flashlight up until he finally spotted an outline of creatures another 100 yards up. Cap,
I got him, he said into the communicator. Got about 500 yards before the start of the fence.
Start firing the Roman candles so we can keep track of them,
Kersey instructed. Yes, sir, Baker said, and clicked off his flashlight, cracking open a big pack of the fireworks and lighting one of them up. He held it in the air, waiting a few seconds for the fuse to work its way inside. Soon, multicolored flaming balls of light flew 20 yards in the air, illuminating the area. While the light wasn't incredibly powerful like a flare, it was bright enough to show the severity of the situation. The horde stretched from curb to curb and even off into the ditches on either side. They moved slowly, but at a deliberate pace, nothing slowing them down. Baker fired into the sky continuously, slowly backpedaling as he did, making sure to keep his proper distance. After the first one burnt out, he quickly lit another and decided to see how far the pack actually went. He stood in place, letting the zombies get within 20 yards, which was a risky but necessary move. He aimed it way over the crowd, far enough away that he could see over their heads. The flaming ball floated through the sky, descending back to the crowd. Baker gasped as the light illuminated zombies as far back as he could see. "Cap, we got a real shit show on our hands," he said into his communicator. "This pack covers the whole road and stretched back at least 60-70 yards.
I'll let Kowalski know,"
Kersey came back.
"Keep at it, because these fireworks have a small window where they're going to be effective."
"Yes, sir," Baker replied, and backed up about 50 yards away from the mob, wanting a bit more of a cushion. He lit up another Roman candle, waiting patiently for the first one to go off. A bright blue flame leapt out from the end, flying through the air into the crowd. Instead of it falling silently, however, there was a loud metallic thud. "What the hell?" Baker muttered, confused, and moved his arm as the next round fired, sending it careening off into the side of the road. He readjusted his aim, trying to find the same trajectory as before. A few seconds later, a bright green flame shot out, arcing through the air, another metal thud echoing. "Cap, we might have a situation," he said into the communicator. But before Kersey could respond, another flame went into the crowd, and Baker caught sight of the figure towering over the heads of the zombies. It was clearly a person, and they aimed a rifle at him. Baker darted to the right just as a shot went off, his shoulder exploding in pain as a bullet ripped through it. He hit the ground hard, stunned.
"Baker, why are you shooting?"
Kersey cried. "It wasn't me, and I'm hit," Baker yelled back through the communicator. "They're in the mob!"
"I'm coming to you,"
the captain replied immediately. Another rifle shot went off, the bullet narrowly missing Baker and punching into the pavement. He pulled out his handgun and fired wildly towards the mob, just above their heads, in the hopes he could hit a target. The odds weren't good with how dark it was, but, at the very least, bullets stopped flying in his direction. Baker crawled, struggling to get to his feet as the zombies grew closer. Another shot went off and forced him back flat against the ground. He turned to see the zombies within 10 yards of him, and fired at a couple of the closest, hitting one of them in the head and tripping up a few of its brethren. It brought him seconds at the most, but it was something. He started to pull himself up again, but another shot from the crowd went off, grazing his other arm. The zombies were within 5 yards, though he didn't have a choice. It was move or get eaten. Baker got to his feet and took off running. More gunfire erupted, but it was from in front of him. Kersey ran up, sending 3-round bursts towards the shooter. The barrage of bullets seemed to be enough to send the shooter retreating for cover. Kersey grabbed Baker's arm and yanked him up, pulling them both away from the coming mob. He fired another 3-round burst for a little more cover, and they retreated into the darkness. The captain led him 50 yards back, taking up position beside a solid fence, concealed in the blackness. "What the fuck is that?" Kersey asked breathlessly. Baker shook his head. "Got to be in a car or something," he suggested. "A car?" Kersey blurted. Baker nodded. "I heard a metallic clang when the Roman candle hit down," he confirmed. "Then they appeared above the zombies and started shooting. Hit me pretty damn good, too." Kersey pursed his lips and checked over his man. "Just a flesh wound. You're fine," he murmured, and then took a deep breath. Okay, one problem at a time. We have one shot to peel some of these things off and give the shooters a chance. I want you back in the truck, though. Baker shook his head, but he knew better than to fight it. His shoulder hurt badly. He sighed, and the two of them took off, him giving Kersey a pat before they split at the field. Kersey ran over to Dawson and Johnson, who had the ground-based fireworks set up. "Everything okay, Cap?" Johnson asked. "You hauled ass out of here, and then there was gunfire." "We have shooters in the horde," Kersey replied flatly. Both soldiers froze, letting out noises of incredulity. "Looks like they're in a car," the captain explained. "Just coasting along like a ship set adrift at sea." "Always some new bullshit with these assholes," Johnson grunted. "So what's the play?" Dawson asked. Kersey motioned as he spoke. "We're going to have to light these things up sooner than I would like," he admitted. "But Baker's already taken a round in the shoulder, so whoever is in there can shoot. Dawson, you're going to be with me laying down cover fire while Johnson lights the fuse. Once that happens, we all haul ass back to the truck, fall back 100 yards, and see how well it works." The two soldiers nodded in agreement and got back to work. After a few moments, Johnson spoke up. "I got this, bud. Y'all go," he said. Dawson and Kersey ran the 30 yards across the field to the edge of the fence. "You got any of those Roman candles?" the captain asked. Johnson reached into his back pocket, pulling out a giant rod and handing it over. Kersey nodded and ran across the street, digging a small angled hole with his knife and shoving it in, aimed down the road. He listened carefully for the sound of moaning, waiting a couple of minutes so it sounded like they were close. Then he lit the fuse and ran back across the street, the two men aiming towards the mob. "They're about 20 yards back in the pack," he murmured. "My guess is they're popping out of the sunroof, so aim just above the zombie heads and we might have a shot at hitting them." Dawson sighed. "Nothing like shooting a target in the dark," he quipped. "Pretty sure he's wearing all black too," Kersey added. "Of course he is," Dawson deadpanned, and the two soldiers aimed downrange, listening as the zombie footsteps and moans grew louder. A few moments later, the Roman candle ignited, sending a blue ball of light flying through the air, showering the lumbering mass of rotting flesh. But no shooter. "Johnson, light it up!" Kersey bellowed, and a few moments later Johnson's boots pounded up to them as he joined them. "About 15 seconds until it goes," the private said. "Get to the truck," Kersey instructed, and kept his gun trained on where he suspected the enemy was, as the various colored balls of light lit up. Finally, he spotted movement above the ghouls and fired, missing, but forcing the gunman back through the roof. "Yeah, try that again, please," the captain muttered, and kept aiming, waiting for the enemy to pop back up and try another shot. But before he could, the fireworks went off. It was bright enough to give away his position, which put him at a severe disadvantage, and he broke from cover. He ran backwards, firing a 3-round burst as he tried to buy himself a few moments to get further into the darkness. He ran hard, never hearing a shot from behind him. When he reached the truck about 150 yards away, the others sat up save for Baker, who was focused on tending to his wound in the passenger seat. "Did you hit that asshole?" he asked. Kersey shook his head as he got into the driver's seat. "I don't think so," he said. "Come on, Cap, you're better than that," Baker replied with a sigh. "We'll get him," Kersey promised. "You have my word." The quartet watched as the fireworks did their job, pulling zombies from the road and into the field. About 100 or so made it in. "Hell yeah, at least this wound isn't for nothing," Baker quipped. A few seconds later, however, a loud horn blared from inside the horde. The soldiers stared in disbelief as the zombies from the field turned around and wandered back to the road. "You've gotta be shitting me," Dawson breathed. The zombies in front of the car turned and tried to attack it, but there were just too many behind it with enough force to keep pushing it forward. It took about 50 yards, but once they lay off the horn, the ghouls pushed and gave up, walking forward again. "Dawson, how much ammo you got?" Kersey asked. "2 mags, came the reply. "Johnson, take the truck and get Baker back to town," the captain instructed. "Grab ammo, a couple of pipe bombs, whatever you can, and get back to us ASAP." "What are you going to do?" Johnson asked. Kersey squared his shoulders as he got out of the truck. We're going to start clearing out zombies in front of the car, he declared. We can't hit what we can't see, so if we can get a shot, we might have a chance. I'll let Kowalski know what's up too, Johnson promised as he slid into the driver's seat. Okay, get moving, Kersey said, and the soldier fired up the truck, not turning on the headlights before screaming down the road back towards Kuna, no more than 1.5 miles away. Kersey and Dawson stood on the side of the road, watching the outline of the mob fade into the darkness as the fireworks trap died down. How do you want to do this, Cap? Dawson asked. Kersey thought for a moment, running through ideas and scenarios in his head. For now, I want to stay back, out of their effective firing range, he said slowly. It's dark, so they're going to have trouble getting a lead on us, which means we fire and move. Do not, under any circumstances, fire twice from the same spot. That's a good call, Dawson said. We fire at head height and hope for the best, at least until Johnson gets back, Kersey added. Dawson nodded firmly. Okay, let's do this, he said. The two soldiers nodded at each other, walking out to the middle of the road and taking aim as best they could. A stray beam of moonlight came through a crack in the clouds, hitting part of the zombie mob near the back, but doing little to help them aim. It did, however, do a great job of showing just how many ghouls there were. Kersey took a deep breath as he aimed. Fire and move, he said. You ready? Dawson stood aiming as well, letting out a soft, yep. Light 'em up, Kersey said, and they both fired, sending a 3-round burst towards the horde. The darkness concealed where the bullets ended up, but they sprayed and prayed before breaking apart and moving back to the sides of the road to set up for another shot. Kersey knew this wasn't very effective, but at the moment, they didn't have any other option. Chapter 7. Copeland and Bretts sat in a holding cell, having been freed from their restraints. Across from them in a neighboring cell was an older couple, a man kneeling down in front of a woman who sat on the edge of a cot, sobbing uncontrollably. Bretts and Copeland spoke quietly, as there was a guard right outside the room. Well, at least they didn't execute us on sight, Bretts murmured. Got that going for us at least. Copeland grunted. Day's not over yet, he muttered. Didn't realize you were such an optimist, Bretts quipped. The sergeant jutted out his chin. You got any bright ideas? He asked. Yep, the corporal replied with a nod. Overheard one of them saying that somebody named Joshua is going to have a talk with us. I assume it's not going to be a simple chat. Unless you're part of the Manson family, it won't be, the guy in the other cell piped up. The soldiers glanced at him, taking in his hysterical partner. Torture? Bretts asked. The man simply nodded. Copeland leaned in. You got a way out of this cage? He whispered to Bretts. Yep, the corporal confirmed. I'll make sure I go with Joshua. Then, the sergeant said, just don't take your time. I won't be long, Bretts promised. Who are you guys? The guy in the cell asked, brow furrowing. Couple of travelers just passing through, Copeland quipped. Worry about yourself over there. Bretts inclined his head towards the sobbing woman. Your lady there, is she all right? He asked. The man simply shook his head, gripping her hand tightly. She blinked rapidly, struggling to catch her breath, and looked up at the two men. You, she gasped. You look like soldiers. Are you friends with that Kowalski boy? Bretts nodded. We are, he said. I'm so sorry for what we did to him. We didn't know, she said, shaking her head. We were just desperate. If I could just go back, she choked. It's been rough here for us, the man said softly. She growled, snatching her hand away from him. You just got slapped around a little, she snapped, and curled her legs up under her chin. I'm the one that looks like good breeding stock. Her gaze darkened, and she looked more angry than upset, tears turning to rage. Bretts nodded, wanting to offer some kind of condolences, but the door to their prison opened. Two guards entered, flanking a man in a lab coat with a hungry sneer. Well, well, the man, clearly Joshua, drawled. 2 new people to be interviewed. I wonder if you'll tell me more than your friend did yesterday. Copeland jutted out his chin. I sincerely doubt it, you pencil-dicked mama's boy, he snapped. Oh, we have a feisty one, Joshua said, glee lighting up his face. Think you're tough, do you? The sergeant smirked at him. Tough enough for whatever you think you're going to throw at me, he challenged. Joshua licked his lips as if he'd found something delicious, and raised a hand. Guards? Let's start with him, he declared. I have a feeling his screams will pierce these walls, making his friend a lot easier to deal with. Brett clenched his jaw to bite back a snappy zinger, not wanting to draw attention to himself so that their plan would continue. One of the guards stepped to the far end of the cell, aiming a shotgun through the bars towards them. He was close enough to shred both of them, but far enough away that they wouldn't be able to get to him in time. If you don't come quietly, he fires, Joshua declared. Understood? Oh, I ain't missing this party for anything, Copeland quipped with a wide grin. He extended his arms, wrists up and fists together, so that he could be cuffed. The guard secured him, opened the gate, and the four of them left the prison. The man in the next cell shook his head. Your friend looks strong, but, he said, taking a deep breath, Joshua has his ways. Brett leapt into action, dropping his facade and unbuckling his belt. Not going to be an issue, he quipped. What are you doing? The man asked, eyes widening as he moved closer to the bars. A recently departed friend of mine taught me the importance of being prepared for a situation like this, the corporal said, pulling out a thin piece of metal that was perfect for working on the lock. And this is my way of honoring his memory. The man nodded, chewing on his lip as Brett reached through the bars and went to work. It took him a few moments, but he was able to get it just right, unlatching it. He started to open the door, but the man held out a hand. Wait, wait, he hissed frantically. Brett cocked a brow. What? There's going to be 2 guards by the door, and the door opens in, the man gushed. You're going to need help if you're getting out. The corporal shook his head. No offense, he drawled, but with a doorway that narrow, you'd just get in my way. I may not look like much, but I can throw down, the man insisted. And I wasn't suggesting we go out the door together. They know the condition of my wife here. I make a call for help, maybe only one of them comes in here. While they're looking at her, you get the drop on them. Brett nodded thoughtfully. Okay, let's try it your way, he agreed. This works, I'll take you with me out of here. The man looked at his wife. Karen, baby, I need you to lay down in the fetal position, he said gently. Just look away. You don't need to see any of this. She sucked in a sharp breath and nodded, wiping at her eyes as she lay down. Once she was in position, her husband pressed himself against the bars. Guard! Guard! He cried. Please help! Something is wrong with my wife! Please! After several moments of shouting, a lone guard entered, his face stern. What do you want? He snapped. There's something wrong with her, the man pleaded. Please, I need help. The guard looked suspicious, carefully walking over to the cage. He looked inside, turning his back to Brett's, and stared at the prone woman for a moment before clucking his tongue. She just looks like she's sleeping, he said dryly. But I don't think she's breathing, the man cried. The guard rolled his eyes. Give her a good shake and see what happens, he suggested. The man hesitated, and the guard growled, but before he could get another word out, Brett locked his arms around his neck, twisting it violently to the side. It took a few moments of the guard thrashing about before Brett was able to snap his neck. The body fell limp, and the corporal tossed him to the ground. You all right in there? The guard from the hallway asked. Take care of him, the man in the cell whispered. I'll get the keys. Brett nodded and rushed to the door as it started to open. The guard just stepped inside as the corporal lowered his shoulder and drove it right into his chest. The impact was forceful enough that it knocked the guard clean off of his feet, driving him back into the hallway. They landed hard on the floor, knocking the wind out of the guard with a loud whoosh. Brett pounced up and punched him in the throat, severely damaging the windpipe, and the guard gasped for air before the corporal jabbed him enough times that he just asphyxiated. As he pulled himself to his feet, the other prisoner startled him as he emerged from the prison room. He held out a handgun from the other guard. Here, I'm going to assume you're a better shot than I am, he said. Brett nodded, taking the gun and then motioning to the shotgun laying on the floor. "Think you can hit something with that?" he asked.
"If I can't, then I have no business living in this part of the world,"
the man replied solemnly as he picked up the gun. "Where did Joshua take Copeland?" Brett asked. The man pointed to a door down the hallway, about 10 yards. There was nobody else in sight, and they crept closer. When they reached it, the corporal pressed his ear against the wood, listening carefully to try to hear any noise inside. He could hear the lab-coated man speaking, but nothing else. "Does he keep anybody else in there?" Brett whispered to his companion. The man nodded. "2 men, either side of the door," he whispered back. "At least there was when I was in there." Brett nodded and readied his handgun. The door would open into the room instead of out, and he got ready to breach. After a silent countdown, he shoved his shoulder into the door to fling it open, while at the same time keeping his handgun at head height. As soon as he cleared the threshold, he spotted a guard standing and staring straight ahead. He pulled the trigger immediately to put a bullet in that guy's temple, and the door smacked into the other guard. Once it stopped, Brett whipped around and fired into the wooden door several times. He quickly popped around the frame, seeing the man on the ground, bleeding out. "What is the meaning of this?" Joshua shrieked. Brett stepped forward, aiming his gun right at Joshua, and the lab-coated man dropped his scalpel and flung his hands into the air. "Shut your mouth, or you're going to find out," the corporal declared. Joshua nodded furiously, eyes wide with fear as Brett checked on Copeland. The sergeant had been secured to an X-cross, his shirt open with several bleeding cuts on his chest. "Beginning to wonder how long you were going to take," Copeland drawled. "Sorry, took a minute to get the guard's attention," Brett replied. The other prisoners walked in, looking around at the mess. "Ma'am, could you please untie my friend there?" Brett asked, and Karen nodded jerkily, picking her way over to Copeland to work on his bonds. The corporal cocked his head at the man expectantly. "What's your name, bud?" "Oh, Dennis," the man replied, pointing to himself. "Dennis, go to the front and see if we attracted any unwanted attention with those gunshots," Brett instructed, and the man nodded, running out the door. After a few moments, Copeland stepped away from the X-cross and grabbed Joshua by the neck, slamming his smaller body against it. "Ma'am, would you be so kind as to help me secure him?" he asked. Karen narrowed her eyes. "With pleasure," she said, and tightened the bonds around the torturer's limbs. "Nobody heard a thing," Dennis said as he re-entered the room. "They're popping off a few shots at the front gate, so it looks like we got lucky, and they were drowned out." Brett nodded. "Good job," he said, and then turned to Copeland. "Sergeant, do your thing." Copeland left his shirt open, wounds still bleeding freely, his shoulders straightening as he exuded the alpha dog mentality, as if the cuts didn't bother him at all. He stepped up closer to Joshua, a hair's breadth away, staring him down. The man in the lab coat looked like he was trying not to show fear, but a sweat broke out on his forehead, and his eyes swelled. "You wanted to chat earlier," Copeland said menacingly. "So, we're going to chat." He grabbed Joshua's button-down shirt, ripped it open. He stepped over to the table where the blades were spread out in a canvas roll-up, and picked out a nasty-looking serrated knife. "One of the first things I learned about interrogation is that the person needs to believe that whatever you say is going to happen actually happens," Copeland said as he stalked back over to the cross. "Sometimes it's as simple as promising to get them a cup of coffee. Other times it's to promise to take care of their family once they're locked away. Normally my interrogations don't involve blades, but I believe that lesson still applies. So, if you don't answer my questions, I'm going to cut you. Allow me to demonstrate." He raised his chin. "What's the 77th largest city in Texas?" he asked. Joshua sputtered, shaking his head violently. "How the hell am I supposed to know that?" he cried. "You're not," Copeland said, and dragged the knife across the man's chest, eliciting a shriek. "But you didn't answer my question, and we've established I'm a man of my word, and there are consequences for not doing so. Do you agree?" Joshua nodded furiously. "See? You answered my question, and I didn't cut you," Copeland said with a grin. "So, now that you know I'm a man of my word, let's begin. Where is Wade?"
"Who?"
Joshua blurted. Copeland stared into the man's eyes, staring suspiciously, but he could see it was a sincere response. "The man who came here with us," the sergeant replied. "Or should I say, delivered us here." Joshua shook his head jerkily. "I'm not certain, but I overheard the guards saying that they took a newcomer to Mr. Harris's house to talk," he gushed. "Good, good," Copeland cooed. "That's probably him. Now, where is Mr. Harris's house?" "Other side of the community," Joshua said quickly. 4 blocks down. Big house on the corner of the road. Bigger than anything else around. You can't miss it." Copeland pursed his lips and turned to the corporal, who shook his head. "That's a hell of a run with a handgun, shotgun, and a knife," Brett said. "There's got to be an armory, right?" Copeland asked. "You don't have this much firepower and don't keep it locked up." Brett nodded. "Worth asking him about," he said. "Did he tell you anything?" Dennis asked as he poked his head in from the hallway. "Just where our man is," Copeland replied. "Ask him where they keep the other slaves," Dennis suggested. The sergeant shook his head. "Look, man, this isn't a rescue operation," he said. "So you're just going to leave dozens of people behind?" Dennis accused, stepping into the room and crossing his arms. "I thought you were supposed to protect innocent life." The soldiers shared a look, and then Brett shrugged. "We have a hell of a run to make," he said slowly. "We could use some extra guns on our side to stir up some chaos." Copeland took a deep breath. "Yeah, you're right," he agreed, and turned back to Joshua. "You're doing good. Keep this up, and you might be able to recognize yourself in the mirror once we're done. Now, where do they keep the other captives?" "Why would you care about lower life force like that?" Joshua asked, suddenly finding a burst of courage. Copeland didn't waste a beat, slashing the man's chest deeply again, letting the serrated blade shred his skin. "I'm asking questions, not you," he snarled. "Now where do they keep them?" Joshua groaned and whined in pain, his head lolling, but the sergeant slapped his cheek to get him to focus. "There's 2 places," the bound man sputtered. "House right by the front gate, and another one at the back of the compound." Copeland poked him in the gut with the knife, almost hard enough to break skin. "Gonna need to be a little more specific on that one," he said in a low voice. "It's along the back wall," Joshua cried. "Only house with bars on the windows." Copeland removed the knife and then tapped it on his chest, making him flinch. "See? That wasn't so difficult," he drawled. "Now, one more question for you. Where is the armory?" "We don't have an armory," Joshua spat. Copeland dragged the knife down his chest slowly, drawing out the screams of pain. "I'm betting you do," he said. "No, we don't," Joshua yelped. "I know where it is," Dennis piped up. Copeland turned to face him, cocking a brow. "Let's hear it then," he urged, a little annoyed that the man had broken up his tirade, but interested in hearing what he had to say. "I'm about 95% sure it's the place," Dennis continued. "It's a house a block behind us, blue one, single story." Brett cocked his head. "What makes you think that's the armory?" he asked. "Because when they were taking me to do some work, I saw 2 armed guards standing outside of the front door, and another one walking the perimeter," Dennis explained. "I thought it was just where they were holding the other captives, but he didn't mention it at all. If it's not captives, it's gotta be something important." The soldiers exchanged a look, shrugging and nodding. "Good enough place to start," Brett said. Copeland turned back to Joshua, who looked wild and panicked, letting the sergeant know that Dennis had been right. He grinned and tossed the knife down onto the table, eliciting a sigh of relief from his captive. That relief was short-lived, however, when Copeland picked up a bone saw from the table, swinging it hard at neck level. "You've hurt enough people, you sadistic fuck!" he snapped, and tossed the saw down as Joshua went limp. The sergeant closed up his shirt and looked over the table of blades, picking up the biggest knife he could find. Brett grabbed the next largest for his offhand. "Can we go out the front?" Copeland asked. Dennis shook his head. "I wouldn't," he replied. "Too exposed to the front gate." "Is there a back way out of this place?" Copeland asked. "Back door is boarded up tight," Dennis replied. Brett raised an eyebrow. "I don't recall seeing bars on the windows in the cell room," he suggested. "Unless I'm completely turned around, it should be a straight shot to the armory," Dennis said. Copeland nodded and squared his shoulders. "Let's move like we have purpose," he said, hyper-focused. He was ready to lay waste to anyone in his path. The others fell in line, even Karen, who'd seemed to completely embrace her rage. Copeland casually stepped over the corpse in the middle of the cell room, reaching the back window and looking out. There was a yard with a short chain-link fence separating it from another. There were a few houses on the other side, and despite the darkness, it was clear there was no movement. Some light dotted the road on the other side, thanks to some more of those solar garden lights along the path. "We get out this window and move quick up to the next house," Copeland said. "Stay in the shadows and nobody fires a gun. If there's a threat, we take it out silently. The last thing we need to do is draw attention to ourselves, good?" The other three nodded. "Let's move then," Copeland said, and opened the window to hop out. He kept watch while the others got outside and then led them quickly across the yard and over the fence to approach the edge of the next house. He held them up as he peeked from the shadows to survey the situation. There was a house in the middle of the block with 2 guards standing at the front door. A few moments later, a lone guard walked around the side, waving to the guys in front as he walked by before continuing his trip around. Copeland turned and whispered, "Here's the plan. I'm going a couple of houses over, crossing the street and sneaking up on the roving guard. Once he's down, I'm going to come up to the front. As soon as I get their attention, I want you to get across the street and hit them from behind." He pointed to Brett's, who nodded. "What do you want us to do?" Dennis asked, inclining his head to Karen. "As soon as you see us take them down, haul ass to the door and get it open," Copeland said. Dennis nodded sharply. "I can do that," he promised. "Watch for my signal," Copeland said, and then broke from the group, running to the back of the house and sprinting down several buildings, hopping a few fences in the process. Finally, he reached the end of the block, checking to make sure nobody else was around before crossing the street. Once he made it, he took a knee at the edge of the house, looking around to make sure he hadn't been seen. Copeland worked his way through the backyards of the houses, reaching the one right beside the target. He laid in wait by the back of the house, listening for the roaming guards as he said, "Howdy," to the guys at the front. The sergeant gripped the knife tightly, waiting on the guard to make the turn into the backyard. Once he did so, Copeland stalked his prey. He didn't run, just walked at a deliberate pace with his feet light, keeping his footsteps silent. Finally, within a couple of yards, he struck, putting his hand over the guard's mouth and slitting his throat. As he gurgled his last breath, Copeland laid the man on the ground, wiping his knife clean, before dragging him into the shadows. The sergeant came around the side of the house, spotting the faint outline of Brett's across the street. He motioned with his hand and then came up to the corner, carefully peeking around to spot the 2 guards. They stood on the porch, just hanging out, a couple of average-sized guys with hunting rifles slung over their shoulders. They weren't very imposing, and didn't seem to be used to any resistance. Copeland readied his knife and covered his mouth a bit to muffle the sound. "Guys, we need a hand over here," he called. "Come on, man, quit messing around," one of the guards whined. "Seriously, need a hand," Copeland insisted. The other guard sighed. "Damn it, man, I was comfortable," he groaned. "This better be good." Copeland waited for them to come down from the porch and start walking towards him. He glanced over at Brett's, who moved to the other side of the house and out of their line of sight. As they got closer, the corporal made his move, making sure to stay quiet on the pavement. Copeland readied his knife, and as soon as the first guard came around the corner, he jammed it directly underneath the man's mouth, pinning his jaw shut. He shoved the guy back into his friend, hoping to knock the other guard down, but it didn't work. The sergeant rushed forward to attack, but the stabbed guard grabbed his leg. The other guard struggled to get his rifle off of his shoulder, but Brett sprinted up, making noise from behind him, and the guard whipped around to face him, just in time to get a knife to the heart. The man yelped, but Brett clapped a hand over his mouth to cover up the sound, stabbing him a few more times to finish him off, as Copeland did the same to his. No sooner had the skirmish begun, was it over in a bloody display. Dennis and Karen ran up to the door and turned the knob, opening it just as Brett's and Copeland arrived with their dead guards, dragging them inside. The sergeant turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I need you to keep a watch out," he said gently. "If somebody comes by and notices that there aren't any guards out front, this ride is going to get real bumpy. Having a heads up on that would be appreciated." She nodded firmly. "I'll let you know if I see anything," she promised. "Thank you," Copeland said, and then turned to the others. "Okay, let's find us some weapons." They roamed the house, finding a few rooms worth of guns. Most were hunting rifles, which Brett's picked out one with a high-powered night vision scope and magazine. "Wouldn't be my first choice," Copeland said. Brett shrugged. "Figure Wade is going to need something," he explained. "Might as well get him something he's good with." "Make sure you give him a bag of ammo," Copeland agreed with a nod, "because that boy likes to shoot." Brett's found a canvas duffel bag and loaded it up with magazines as Copeland moved on to the next room that was full of assault rifles. "Now we're talking," the sergeant said, and picked one up with a grin. Dennis entered, eyes wide. "I got something I think you're going to want to see," he said. Copeland followed him into the other room that was full of several wooden crates with military markings. "Looks like our friends took a field trip to that military base nearby," Dennis said, and reached into the box, pulling out a large frag grenade. Copeland's grin grew wider. "They're about to realize that was a big mistake," he drawled. "You know how to use these?" "Wait until you tell me, then I pull the pin and throw?" Dennis asked. The sergeant nodded. "That is the correct answer," he replied. "Get loaded up. We're about to start some shit." Chapter 8. The front edge of the zombies were now a half a mile away from Kowalski's location as he looked through his scope, trying to get a read on a target to shoot. The darkness posed a major problem, and the occasional light burst from a Roman candle was doing little to help. "Come on, guys, give me something," he murmured. A Molotov suddenly flew into the front edge of the crowd, as if in answer to his prayer. It was enough to light the way for the ghouls at the front, but he still couldn't see the car 20 yards back. "Well, that's something," he muttered, and aimed at the front edge of the horde. He dropped ghoul after ghoul with headshot after headshot. On the ground, Kersey, Johnson, and Dawson took aim, squeezing off shots and each hitting zombies before switching up positions. As they did this, the gunmen in the crowd aimed and fired, thankfully not hitting the soldiers in the darkness. Kersey looked back at the front edge of the town that was starting to close in. They'd barely put a dent in the throng of zombies and still had the car to deal with. "Johnson, pipe bomb!" Kersey barked. "Go for the car!" The private ran up and jumped over a solid fence, giving him cover to light the fuse so that the gunman didn't aim for the constant brightness. He took a deep breath to steady himself before quickly standing up and lobbing it towards the center of the mass, hoping it was far enough. Then he hit the deck to avoid being shot. The bomb flew through the air and landed near the center of the crowd, clanging on the pavement. A few seconds later it clanged some more, clearly being kicked around and moving forward. By the time it detonated, it was almost at the front of the pack. While it did a good job of wiping out a couple dozen creatures, the car was still embedded deep within the crowd. "Johnson, how many of those you got?" Kersey asked. "3, came the reply. Dawson lit up another Molotov and tossed it towards the ground in front of the mob, giving them and Kowalski targets to shoot at. "Johnson, light 'em and throw 'em at the front of the pack," Kersey instructed. "Maybe we can clear enough of them away for Kowalski to get a shot at the shooter." "On it, Cap," Johnson replied, and ran back a little ways, giving himself more room. He lit the bombs in quick succession, throwing them as soon as they were lit. One by one they clanged on the ground, and he spread it around in front of the zombie mob. "Fire in the hole!" he cried, and the other soldiers took cover as the trio of bombs detonated, one after the other. Body parts flew through the air, rotted flesh spraying everywhere, creating a gap at the front of the pack. "Dawson, light it up!" Kersey cried. The soldier in question tossed another Molotov, and it hit the ground and lit up the front edge of an older 80s car, full steel with blackout windows. Kersey raised his rifle and squeezed off a 3-round burst towards the driver's seat, but the window of opportunity closed, and the bullets hit zombies in front of it. "Damn it," he muttered, and then into his communicator he asked, "Kowalski, do you have a shot?" The sniper aimed, firing a round towards the driver's seat, but it was blocked by a ghoul. He took aim again, but before he fired, the car hit the brakes, allowing zombies to push ahead and create a buffer again. "Damn it, missed the shot," his voice came through. "You aren't the only one," Kersey grunted. "Dawson, you got any more Molotovs?" he asked. "Just one, Cap," Dawson replied. "Kowalski, the pipe bombs are a bust. They just get kicked away from the car," the captain said into the communicator. "We're going to light 'em up one more time. Shoot what you can, then get back behind the gates, or else you're going to be trapped. We'll fight this battle at the wall." Kowalski didn't respond, but when the fire started, he popped off a round. Before he could fire again, he paused. "That car is going to roll right underneath me," he thought. "If I had a bomb that could stick." His eyes grew big as saucers as an idea hit him. He dropped his gun and ran for the door, racing down the stairs as he screamed into his communicator. "I got an idea, Cap!" he cried. "Get back to safety! I got this!" Kersey responded, but Kowalski was running so hard he couldn't hear it. It didn't matter, though, because his mind was made up. He ran out into the street, racing 3 blocks back towards the gate. As he approached, he screamed, "Open up! Open up!" The gate opened just enough for him to slip in, and Zeke spread his arms as if to ask what was going on. "I need duct tape and nails," Kowalski huffed. "What?" Zeke stammered. "Just do it," the sniper growled. "Meet me back here in 2 minutes." Zeke ran off as Kowalski tore towards the storage area. He rushed inside, frantically looking around until he found the pipe bombs, the last 2 in the box. As he left, he found a small milk crate of Molotovs, and he grabbed those too. He waddled back to the ground gate, balancing everything in front of him, and Zeke ran up with nails and a couple rolls of duct tape. "I got what you asked for," he said, still sounding confused. Kowalski tossed him a pipe bomb and took a roll of tape and a handful of nails. "Do what I do now," he urged, and pulled off some tape. He pushed a nail through it, putting one every few inches. Once he had a dozen in the long strand of tape, he lined it up with the base of the bomb and laid it in, with the nail sticking out. "I'm tracking," Zeke said, and followed suit, the 2 men wrapping nail-infused tape around the bombs, and following that up with a couple more passes to create a crude spike mechanic. Kowalski wiggled one of the nails, and it was mostly firm. "Gonna have to do," he said. "Open the gate." The gate cracked open again, and he tore through it with his crate of goodies. A block up, he spotted the other 3 running back, long since abandoning their vehicle. Dawson and Johnson were confused as Kowalski tore by them, almost giddy. Kersey attempted to stop him, but he sidestepped him. "Trust me, Cap," he cried. "I know what I'm doing. When I tell you to, fire everything you've got." Kersey turned to the others and shrugged. "You heard the man. Let's go," he barked, and the 3 of them ran back to the gate as Kowalski hauled ass back up the stairs. When he reached the top, his chest heaving, he took a knee near the ledge to catch his breath. "God, I hate cardio," he thought. "Next time I run like that, it damn well better be after I've been bitten by one of those things and turn." He gathered himself, staying low and out of sight, watching the dim outlines of the horde lumbering towards him. The front edge was less than a quarter mile out. As he sat waiting for his time to strike, Kersey's voice came through the communicator.
"Okay, Kowalski, you want to clue me in on your plan here?"
he asked dryly.
"Because in about 2 minutes you're not going to be able to get back behind the gate."
The sniper grinned. "Remember how you said you were having trouble getting the bombs to the car?" he asked.
"Yeah?"
the captain asked. "I MacGyvered something together that should do the trick on the car," Kowalski replied. There was a short pause.
"And if it doesn't?"
Kersey asked. "Then this will officially be my first and last trip to Idaho," Kowalski replied.
"Well, good luck,"
Kersey said.
"We'll be ready on your signal. Somehow, I doubt you'll have to call it in."
The sniper barked a laugh. "No, I will not," he said. The line went quiet, and he sat, waiting for his moment to strike. He debated with himself about how much light he was going to need, but as the mob grew closer, he realized he was going to need a lot, because he couldn't make out the car at all. "Assholes really painted the whole thing black," he muttered, and looked down at the milk crate. There were 6 Molotovs in there, and he picked one up, setting it on the ground, contemplating and then grabbing 2 more. "Fuck it, when have you ever been subdued?" he murmured to himself. The sniper waited a few more minutes as the front edge of the zombies reached the corner of the building. He let them walk another 10 yards before he lit up the trio of Molotovs, picking them all up at once. "Hope you assholes like barbecues," he cried, and dropped all 3 at the same time. He made sure they were spread horizontally over the crowd, and a few seconds later they came crashing down, lighting up the ghouls spectacularly. Kowalski was momentarily stunned at how far back the mob went, but quickly snapped out of it when a shot went off, hitting the edge of the building. "Oh, that's how it's going to be, huh?" he drawled. "All right." He knelt down and lit up one of his nail-infused pipe bombs. Kowalski stood up, quickly finding his target and throwing it down with as much force as he could. His aim left a lot to be desired, as he missed by a good 10 yards, landing behind the car. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "Really wish I would have asked for a baseball glove for one of my birthdays. Would have come in real handy right about now." Kowalski lit the other one and readied himself before standing up. He lined up his target and threw, hoping beyond hope that he didn't miss that time. The bomb spun in the air, headed in the right direction, and he held his breath. Come on, come on. The bomb landed on the front hood of the car, embedding into the metal and sticking about a yard away from the front windshield. "Hell yeah!" he cried. "Get some!" The sunroof opened, and a figure began to crawl out, and Kowalski snarled. "Oh, no you don't," he warned, and raised his rifle, taking aim and firing. He hit the man in the back, leaving him motionless on the windshield. He kept his aim on the body, seeing him move ever so slightly, as if he was being moved by a panicked person on the inside. "Okay, Cap, here's your signal," Kowalski said, and the bomb detonated, sending the car up in a spectacular fireball. The sniper ducked back as some shrapnel hit the side of the building, causing him to let out a celebratory yell. Once that died down, he looked over the edge, seeing that the zombies had stopped moving forward, instead hovering around the wrecked vehicle, almost blocked in by half the road. The fire was bright, giving the shooters at the wall plenty of well-lit targets. "Told you I had it under control, Cap," Kowalski said proudly into his communicator.
"You're a madman,"
Kersey came back.
"Just glad you're our madman."
"Let me know when you boys need some more light," Kowalski replied with a laugh. "I got 3 Molotovs left, so I can top 'em off."
"Will do,"
Kersey said, and the line went quiet. Kowalski aimed his rifle, reloading and readying his next shot. He scanned the crowd, looking back a good 60 yards until the light faded. "Looks like this one is going to be an all-nighter," he said as he scanned the thick-packed zombies. He found his next target and fired, ripping a hole into the side of a skull. He chambered another round and settled in for the long haul. Chapter 9. Copeland and Brett stood by the front door, looking out to keep an eye on anybody noticing that the guards were missing. There was a tense moment as they spotted 2 people walking up the next block, making the turn going towards the front gate where there was still an occasional pop of gunfire. Brett's had the hunting rifle over his shoulder, as well as an assault rifle for himself, and handguns for them both. Over his shoulder was the canvas bag filled with ammo and a couple of grenades. "That was almost bad," the corporal murmured. "We could have handled it," Copeland said firmly, his eyes stone-focused. "No doubt," Brett replied, "but glad we don't have to." He paused, raising an eyebrow. "So, you got a plan?" he asked. "Kill everybody who has been killing us, save the hostages, and get back in time for breakfast," Copeland replied. The corporal chuckled. "I like it," he said. "One of us needs to get to Wade. If shit goes sideways, we're going to need his gun." "You have at it," Copeland said. "Where are you causing trouble at?" Brett asked. The sergeant tilted his head back and forth. "I think our best hope of pulling this off is getting some captives to take up arms with us," he said. "So I'm going to the front gate to get them out. I figure those guards are going to have their backs turned to us, so we'll get a jump on them. If you don't mind, can you give me a couple of minutes to get in position?" the corporal asked. "They might get a little suspicious of Wade if you start blowing shit up." Copeland chuckled. "Saw the grenades, huh?" he asked. "Oh yeah, grabbed a couple for myself," Brett replied with a smirk. Copeland looked at his watch, setting a 10-minute timer. He hit start, extended his fist for a bump, and stared at Brett's expectantly. "Clark isn't going to stop," he said dryly. The corporal nodded. "Right," he said. "I'll be on calm." He headed out the door, quickly scanning the area and running towards Ted's house. He crossed the street, staying close to the houses for cover. When he got a block up, he was forced to take cover beside one of the houses as a trio of people walked down the middle of the street. Brett pressed himself up against the side of the house, peeking out and watching as an older family walked along, as if it were a normal day. A nice night for a stroll. They were singing some song that made the kid happy, and he winced as they walked past, hoping they wouldn't get caught in any crossfire. Once they were a few houses down, Brett continued, finding his way to the target house and taking cover across the street. He came around the front corner, peeking out at the two guards in front, and crossed to get into the fenced backyard. Brett crept up to the back of the house, peeking inside at an empty bedroom. He tried the window, surprised that it was unlocked. Before he climbed inside, he whispered into his radio. "In position."
"Eyes on Wade?"
Copeland whispered back. "Negative, but at the target house," Brett replied.
"Copy that,"
the sergeant said.
"You make sure you get him."
"Yes, sir," Brett promised, and stepped softly through the house, praying with every move that the floorboards wouldn't creak. He made it to the bedroom door, cracking it open slightly to strain his ears. There was a short hallway that led into the glow of what looked to be a living room, and he could hear soft voices. He made out Wade's drawl, apparently telling his story of lies once again. At least he's still alive, Brett thought, and I'm going to keep him that way. Copeland stared at his stopwatch as it counted down the last few seconds. Before it started beeping, he clicked it off, staring out the window and speaking to Dennis and Karen. "It's time to go," he said. "If you're not up to this, I understand." Dennis took a deep breath. "We got your back, sir," he said, tightening his grip on his hunting rifle. Karen stood next to him with a handgun, looking very uncomfortable with it. "Do you know how to use that thing?" Copeland asked Dennis. He nodded. "Been hunting since I was 12, he replied. "I can do this." "And Karen?" the sergeant asked, looking a little shaky there.
I'm not that good with these," she admitted, "but I can get them up close."
Copeland nodded. "Suppose anything helps right now?" he said. "Just don't shoot until I do, okay?"
"Okay,"
she agreed, tightening her grip. "Let's move," he said, and led them out into the street, darting across to the house they'd been held in. Around the side they moved up another block, taking a brief moment to let some people wander past and into a house a ways down. Copeland led them a few more blocks up, to the last row of houses before the front gate. They stayed outside, knowing the movement would be important once the battle began. "Stay here," he murmured, and left them by the house, running over to a white picket fence and taking a knee to survey the situation. The front gate was 10 feet tall, made of several layers of sheet metal, and reinforced with a couple of trucks pressed up against it. There was no fence on the brick entrance, but the wall started as soon as the road ended. There were 8 guards at the top of the wall who appeared to be drinking and taking turns firing into the crowd of zombies below. It wasn't sustained fire, just the occasional shot, like they were playing a game and not even concerned about the threat below. There was a ramp walkway on either side of the road leading up to the top. A couple more armed men hanging around the bottom, cracking open a drink and just shooting the shit, their guns slung over their shoulders. Copeland looked around at the houses on either side of the entrance. The one on the left was open, another man coming out carrying something, and walking over to the others to share. The house on the right had bars on the windows, and he assumed that was where the captives were being held. He ran back to the others. 8 men up top, 3 on the ground, he whispered. "Got an open house on the left. Don't know how many inside, but we have to assume there are some." "And the captives?" Dennis asked. "House on the right," Copeland replied. "Impossible to get to without being detected." Dennis nodded. "So what do you want to do?" he asked. "I need 2 shots from you," the sergeant explained. "1 on either side of their line at the top. Pick off each man on the ends, get the rest of them in a panic, and file them right into a bottleneck on the ramps." He raised an eyebrow. "Question is, can you do that?" Yeah, I'll hit 'em, Dennis replied. Can't promise they'll be kill shots, but I can hit center mass from this distance. Copeland nodded. Don't need kill shots, just need to get the others in a panic, he said.
What about me?
Karen asked. There's going to be a lot of gunfire, Copeland explained. So once it starts, aim at a group of them and start pulling that trigger.
Okay,
she confirmed. Once we take them out, I'm making a run for the other captives, Copeland said. When I go, I want you to fall back to the armory. We'll lock it up tight until you get there, Dennis promised. Okay. You two get into the house. I'm taking up position by that tree in the front, Copeland said. Dennis, whenever you're ready, you set us off. There were nods all around, and the three got into position. The sergeant took a knee by the tree, switching the assault rifle to 3-round bursts, and keeping a close eye on the guards. There was an eerie quiet before the storm with no gunshots, no loud chatter, just the moans of the dead outside. A minute went by of this before it came crashing to an end. Dennis fired his first round, hitting the leftmost guard in the shoulder and sending him tumbling forward over the wall. As he screamed on the way down, the other men whipped around, trying to figure out what was happening. Before they could, Dennis fired again, that time at the rightmost flank. He hit a guard in the gut, sending him doubling over in pain. "It's coming from the house!" someone cried, and several guards up top started shooting, forcing Dennis and Karen behind cover. The brick facade did a great job of stopping the bullets. As a few of them on top fired, 4 others ran down the ramp, 3 on one side and 1 on the other. Copeland waited until they were halfway down before popping out from behind his cover. He squeezed the trigger 3 times, as quickly as his gun would allow, sending a hail of bullets in the direction of the trio. He sprayed enough lead towards them and managed to hit all 3. He didn't know if they were kill shots, but the immediate threat was eliminated, for the moment at least. Almost immediately, bullets hit the tree, forcing him back behind it. He tried to aim and return fire, but there was just too much coming his way. He managed to look out towards the house on the left at 6 armed men coming out. "Shit," Copeland muttered. Inside the house, Dennis and Karen watched what was going on, the former popping up to shoot towards the house and wing one of the men. Karen aimed her handgun and blindly pulled the trigger towards the group, not knowing if she hit anything or anyone. Dennis looked out at the overwhelming odds against them. There would be reinforcements coming, and it would just get worse and worse. He looked down at his belt, at the grenade. "Baby, do you have any more bullets?" he asked.
"Yeah, 1 more clip,"
Karen replied. "Okay, I got a bad idea, but I need your help," Dennis replied. His wife raised an eyebrow.
"What are you going to do?"
she asked. He held up the grenade, and she swallowed hard with a firm nod.
"You make those bastards pay for what they did to me,"
she said. "I love you," he said. She squeezed his arm.
"Love you too."
She waited for him to pull the pin, and then, when he nodded, she aimed out the window and pulled the trigger as fast as she could. The first bullets headed towards the guards as Dennis flung open the door and tore into the yard. He reared back, throwing the grenade as hard as he could towards the gate. As soon as he let go, he dove back in through the door as bullets ripped it to shreds. "Get down!" he screamed as he kicked the door shut, and Karen hit the floor. A few moments later, a deafening explosion racked the air as the grenade detonated under one of the trucks. Copeland watched the truck fling into the air, flipping end over end and ripping through the sheet metal walls like paper. The gunfire in his direction had stopped, and screams of terror erupted from the front gate. Zombies began to flood in, overwhelming several of the guards. A few got bitten but dragged away by their friends, while others were swallowed up by the mob. He smacked his communicator. "Zombies have breached the gate!" he yelled, and didn't wait for a response, tearing for the back door of the house and throwing it open. "Karen, Dennis, we gotta go," he bellowed. The couple ran up to him, breathing hard. "Sorry, I know that wasn't part of the plan," Dennis huffed. "Doesn't matter, it's done," Copeland replied. "Get back to the armory. We'll hold up there." He led them out the back as sporadic gunfire echoed, followed by screams and very excited moans. Chapter 10. Brett stood in the back bedroom, listening to the living room talk. He waited patiently. As long as voices didn't rise and threats weren't made, he was content to sit tight and wait on Copeland. Gunfire intensified in the distance, pausing the conversation in the other room. "Mitch, go see what that is," Ted said loudly, and Brett heard footsteps exit the house. He listened carefully to the leader's next words. "So, Wade, if that's even your real name, you thought you and your friends would be able to pull a fast one on me?"
"What? No," Wade cried. "I swear, I don't know those guys."
"I don't believe you," Ted replied calmly. The front door opened.
"Sir, we should get you someplace safe," someone said.
"As soon as you put a bullet in this man's head, I will be safe," Ted declared, and Brett took that as his cue. He threw open the door and barreled down the hallway. Wade sat in a chair and a man stood by the far door drawing a gun. The noise startled the man, apparently Mitch, who turned and aimed at the corporal, but Brett had the jump on him. He pulled the handgun trigger several times, hitting Mitch in the chest. Wade dove to the ground as Ted ran into the kitchen. Brett reached the end of the hallway, and a guard from outside entered, firing a shotgun. The round shredded the wall, sending Brett diving for cover. The gunman aimed at Wade, but Brett scrambled to the edge of the hallway and began firing. He missed, but forced the gunman out of the house.
"Wade, you good?"
Brett cried.
"Yeah,"
Wade replied.
"Coming your way,"
the corporal said, and slid a handgun over.
"I'll cover the front. You get whoever ran out the back."
The soldiers leapt up, moving towards their respective targets. Before they could get to them, a loud explosion boomed in the distance.
"Sarge is at it again,"
Wade said. Brett reached the front door, but the guards had run away, so he shut and secured the front door. He turned just in time to see Wade coming back in, but before he could speak, Copeland came through the communicator.
"Zombies have breached the gate,"
he cried. "Shit," Brett muttered. "What is it?" Wade called. "The explosion breached the gate," the corporal called back. "Those things are inside." Wade grunted. "Great. And Ted's in the wind too," he said. "So are the guards," Brett replied. He removed the hunting rifle and handed it over to the other soldier. "Think that'll work?" he asked. "I'll take some heads off with it, that's for sure," Wade replied as he appraised the rifle. "We going after Ted?" Brett shook his head. "They're going to have him locked down tight, even if we do find him," he said. "Not only that, but with zombies flooding in?" "Yeah, not a fan, but I understand the play," Wade said with a sigh. "So what do we do?" "We gotta get these captives out of here," Brett said. "There's a house near the back of the compound, and, shit, one by the front gate. Not sure how we're doing that one." "There was a heavy-duty moving van close to where we came over the wall," Wade suggested. "If we can get that, we should be able to get out of here." More gunshots and screams erupted from outside, prompting the two of them to run to the window to inspect the damage. 2 civilians took off, trying to get away from a couple of runners, with one guard standing and firing. The guard fell as a zombie tore into his face, the other taking off after the shrieking civilians. They didn't last long, and the soldiers turned away from the window, shutting the curtains. "Copeland, you copy?" Brett asked. "What's your 20?
"We're in the armory, stocking up,"
the sergeant replied.
"You get Wade?"
"Wade is secure," Brett confirmed. "Ted Harris is in the wind."
"You in pursuit?"
Copeland demanded. The corporal took a deep breath. "Negative," he said.
"I assume there is a good reason,"
the sergeant said dryly. "Yes, sir," Brett replied. "And I'm going to be frank, Sergeant. I hope you have a good plan, because we got runners. Lots of them." There was a quiet moment on the line before Copeland sighed.
"Shit."
The end. Up next, the battle for Idaho continues.